So welcome everybody. Thanks so much for taking the time to be here today. This is the It Takes Roots webinar focused on grassroots feminism. Want to make a couple of quick announcements before we get started with the bulk of our call. The first is just about language justice. So just so folks know, there is a Spanish line happening simultaneously. If you need that number and you haven't gotten that information yet, actually I can't see it, Yahaira, so I'm gonna toss it to somebody else to read out the chat with the Spanish line number that people can call into. Paige or Yahaira, can one of y'all read that out?
I can read it out.
Thank you.
I'll read it in English and then Spanish in case anybody has joined who needs that in Spanish.
Great.
The phone number is 515-604-9094. En Spanish, el número para llamar para oír la interpretación en español es 515-604-9094. Y voy a poner esa información también en la caja con texto. The code that you'll need to enter when you call that number is 420-986-994#. El código que tiene que entrar cuando llama ese número de teléfono es 420-986-994 y tiene que marcar el símbolo del número.
Great, thank you, Anna. And also just to say, we're going to be tracking questions throughout the call in the chat in English. If you have a question and you are on the Spanish line, you should feel free to text your question to Paige, and the number is 720-475-6670. Again, for Spanish questions, you can text 720-475-6670. Want to give big ups to Florencia and Nico, our interpreters, who are helping make this a accessible space. In the future, we'd like to have more than just Spanish. So please make sure you register early for the upcoming webinars to let us know if there's any other language translation needs. Also, just to repeat again, apologies if this is in webinar format and not in meeting format. Ideally, we'd like to see all of you. It is weird to talk into an abyss, but for logistical purposes, it was just easier to keep it in this format, but we're going to look into trying to create other forums for broader, deeper discussion. The last thing I just wanted to say, this invitation did go out pretty broadly. Just wanted to reiterate to folks that this webinar is really meant for and targeted towards the members of the It Takes Roots alliances. And so if you are not with an organization that identifies as a member of It Takes Roots, that's okay, you're welcome to stay on, but just remember who this is intended for, particularly when we get to the question and answer session. Okay, with that, I think all the logistical announcements are done. Again, my name is Priya. I'm with Grassroots Global Justice, and I'll be moderating the overall panel. But I'm going to kick it to Paige to talk us through about It Takes Roots and the road to the convening.
All right. Thanks, everyone, and welcome again. My name is Paige, she, her, hers, and I'm the national organizer for membership development at Right to the City Alliance. So It Takes Roots is an alliance of 4 alliances. Hopefully you are aware, but just in case, the members are Right to the City Alliance, Climate Justice Alliance, the Indigenous Environmental Network, and Global Grassroots Justice Alliance. We are in the process of trying to bring our members together to build alignment and trust, and we're planning on having a national convening in May of next year. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the road to the convening. There's different ways to get on this road to the convening. The first that we're calling is Take the Bus. So we're having these encuentros. We've been using this term encuentros for a while as it takes roots. And we're going to talk more about the idea of these encuentros and how this fits into the broader process of building our capacity to lead together, not just to lead ourselves, but also to lead a broader united front. And so we think that's only possible when we have trust. And so building that trust and understanding that's what allows us to see that we're in this together. We might have different strategies, but we're moving together toward a shared vision. And so these encuentros, we're trying to initiate 4 regional encuentros that will bring together frontline communities, groups and members from across the 4 alliances in different regions to build relationships and engage in political education and develop regional strategies and ideas for how to contend for power and build a united front together. And when we say frontline communities, we're talking about communities who are on the front lines of the climate crisis, the housing crisis, and many other struggles. Indigenous folks, Black folks, Latinx folks, Asian, Pacific Islander, Arab, and Middle Eastern communities. So we know that the alliances in It Takes Roots are not the only grassroots and frontline forces, but we are a significant force in this movement. And all of us are strategically positioned to lead in this political moment. So we have the regional encuentros that are happening. That's the take the bus route for the attending the It Takes Roots initiated ones, the bike route to host your own encuentro. We're going to have more information about this, but there's a kayak route of participating in the Black Leadership Encuentro of It Takes Roots. The walking route, where you engage your base by utilizing the It Takes Roots survey we're going to be sending out and sharing your input with It Takes Roots ahead of the convening. And then there's the getting on the bullet train route, which is if you are interested in joining the planning committee for the convening in 2020. And if you are interested, please let us know. So yeah, I think is there another slide, Priya? So along this road to the convening, we're also hosting these webinars on a monthly basis to get to know each other's work a little bit better. So the first one was held in June. Then we had CJA talk about the just transition last month. This month is GGJ's Grassroots Feminism framework. Next month will be IEN talking about Indigenous sovereignty and the rights of nature and Mother Earth. And the October webinar will be hosted by Right to the City on affordable housing, land, and right to the city. And the last one will be in November, hosted by GGJ on grassroots internationalism. Along with the webinars, you can also go onto the It Takes Roots website and see our political education toolkit that has materials from each alliance describing sort of our core political frameworks.
Perfect.
Next slide. That's it?
That's it. Thanks, Paige.
Okay, sure.
So we're going to kick it now to Anna and Katya, who are going to give us a little bit of background on Grassroots Global Justice.
Thank you, and welcome to all the participants and attendees, folks watching and listening in to this webinar. I'm glad that this is finally happening. There's been a lot of requests for this sort of political education to be available in this webinar setting so that it's more accessible to folks. So I'll share a little bit about who we are, GGJ, Grassroots Global Justice, because I know that we've got folks listening in from some of our sister alliances and also some ally organizations. So Grassroots Global Justice is an alliance of grassroots base building organizations from across the country. We are a network of about 60 organizations spread across the US. And we've been in existence since the early 2000s, since about 2003, 2004. And we've got some specific work areas that we focus on. And those work areas are our global well-being work, and that is where our climate and environmental justice work happens. We also focus on anti-militarism. That is our work group, or the area of work that focuses on challenging US imperialism, challenging the wars at home, and also challenging the wars abroad, and also challenging the wars at home. So we understand militarism to not only be the wars abroad, but also the militarization of our communities, the policing of our communities, the policing of our schools, understanding that policing and militarism is a response to our communities, generally low-income communities of color. We also do movement building work, and that's one example of our movement building work are the series of political education webinars with our sister alliances through the It Takes Roots Alliance. That is an alliance of 4 alliances: Grassroots Global Justice, the Climate Justice Alliance, and Indigenous Environmental Network, and Right to the City. And then finally, our newest area of work is our gender justice and grassroots feminism work. And that will be the focus of today's webinar. And I will kick it over to a member of our Grassroots Feminism work group and a member of GGJ, Katia, who will talk a little bit about how GGJ stepped into this work and also how they at Kata start to incorporate grassroots feminism into their work.
Thank you, Anna. Can you guys hear me? Yes, okay. Yeah, just to, once again, my name is Katia Ramirez. I am the Food Justice Coordinator at Kata, the Farm Worker Support Committee, and we are a farm worker and immigrant worker organization based in New Jersey. And so before I start giving my input and reflections on the work that has been happening at the within the work group in GGJ around feminists and grassroots feminisms, I wanted to give a brief explanation and information around the World March of Women. And I know that Gracia, we have someone on the line who's going to speak more broadly about the World March of Women. But the World March of Women is an international movement that has been growing for over the last 20 years. They have 65 chapters across the world, with US being the newest, and that was ratified at the 2014 membership assembly, GGJ's membership assembly. So the US World March of Women chapter is under GGJ's umbrella. And the role and the purpose of this movement is to work together across borders to eliminate root causes of poverty and violence against women, which can be seen across seas and across different countries. And as a chapter in the US, I feel like we have the responsibility and the role to support our comrades across seas to fight against US interventions here at home and against US imperialism as well. And so just to give some sort of overview of the work that we've been doing within our working group, and some initiative that was started through the US chapter of the World March of Women, where the Feminist Organizing Schools, which was piloted in 2016 in New Mexico. And the schools were developed because it was determined that more political education on feminism was needed to be able to understand the intersections of our work. And when I say intersections, I refer to environmental justice and grassroots feminisms, or housing justice and grassroots feminisms. And in the case of that, that would be like immigrant justice and farm worker justice with grassroots feminisms. So like I said, the first school was piloted in 2006, and since there's been 3 more because there was a high demand for more political developments within GGJ's membership, and also a growing interest in these political education schools from ally organizations. The most recent one was taking place in Arizona with collaboration. It was a collaboration effort with Black Mesa Water Coalition and the Indigenous Environmental Network. And the interesting thing about having it in collaboration with other organizations is that it has like a specific lens, and in this case, it was focused on Indigenous feminisms. And so I think that the schools are really helpful in understanding our situation and how our experiences are similar, and therefore gives us strength and power by working together. Like I said, there's a lot of intersections, and in one way or another, they overlap and help us align, because at the end of the day, we are all affected by the same cause or the same root that's affecting our current living situations. And it's also something that is not talked about day-to-day routine, but that we all live. And speaking on behalf of Kata, it's like something that people live every day. They live every day with that, and it's not, they don't really get the opportunity to sit down and analyze all that. So this is a great opportunity to be able to experience that. And again, like helping us understand the intersections and the work. But it's been a little more challenging implementing it. Specifically, again, speaking on behalf of Kata, we're not like a women-focused or a feminist-focused organization, but incorporating that lens into the work that we're already doing is something that is helpful in that sense. And just again, participating in the work group has like I said, not even though it's not centered around gender, it gives us the opportunity to start incorporating gender justice into our work, and also like seeing how we can approach our work from that lens, from the feminist lens. And that's important to us because it actually strengthens our current campaign work. And in this case, like just sharing more recently, we want to incorporate women's perspective more into the work that we are already doing. And also, this has given me the opportunity to be part of mass mobilizations like the March against the inauguration of 45 back in 2017, which was historical, and also last year participating in Solidarity to Solutions Week, Week of Actions to Challenge the Global Climate Action Summit. So those are just two examples of the opportunities we've had by participating in the working group, and also like being able to connect with other organizations who might already be doing work from the feminist lens, and how they can help us shape our work that we're doing here with immigrants and farm worker justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Katia, for giving that background and sharing some of that historical context of how GGJ started to develop this grassroots feminism and gender justice component to our work. I'll share a little bit briefly now and more at the end of the webinar about how we're currently understanding the importance of this work, not only within our membership base, but also on a national level, understanding that there is a growing interest and hunger for feminist movement, feminist political education, and we're also noticing a pattern both internationally and nationally here in the US that we're seeing a rise of the right, we're seeing a rise of authoritarianism, and we're also seeing resistance to the rise of authoritarianism, and we're noticing that oftentimes resistance to the rise of neo-fascism and authoritarianism is being led by feminists. That's true internationally, and that is also true here in the US. When we think about the mass protests against Bolsonaro in Brazil, we have seen those protests led by women, by Indigenous women, by Black women, and we're also seeing that pattern in other parts of the world. We're seeing it in the Philippines, we're seeing it in different parts of Europe, where more and more folks from the right are being elected into office. And even at home, when Trump was elected, the response to his inauguration in January of 2017 was one of the largest marches in history, and that was the Women's March. And we might have a critique around the way feminism is showing up in the US in response to the rise of the right, but even if we have some critique, we have a shared politic of understanding that part of what is contributing to the rise of the right is misogyny and patriarchy. And we have an understanding that in order to resist that, we have to have a feminist articulation to our movements. And the way GGJ is proposing this feminist articulation, we're saying we have a grassroots feminist movement, our grassroots feminist resistance. And Priya will actually go into explaining what we mean when we say grassroots feminism and how that differs from, say, for example, mainstream liberal or even neoliberal co-optation of the term feminism. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Anna and Katya. All right, so let's get into talking about what we're actually up against. So what do we mean when we talk about patriarchy? I'm gonna ask Paige to actually insert into the chat a question. And I will read it out in a second, but wanting to make sure that we're really approaching this current context with an understanding, a systemic understanding of oppression. Because if we think about patriarchy just in terms of interpersonal relationships, we're cheating ourselves, right? We're not allowing ourselves to see the scale and the embeddedness of the issue that we're up against. We're not allowing ourselves the opportunity to identify a collective target, and we're not allowing ourselves to draw our experiences together and grow our collective power. So by not recognizing root causes, sorry y'all, I talk fast. By not recognizing root causes, it forces us to focus on things like high profile cases of sexual assault without really questioning the carceral state, right? So in thinking about patriarchy in a systemic way, I wanted y'all to answer this question, and many of you will, I'm sure, get it right. Pop quiz. What is an example of patriarchy out of the following? Is it A, I identify as a woman, my coworker who identifies as a man makes more than me for doing the same job? B, a law is passed telling me that I can't use the bathroom that aligns with my gender identity and that I am most comfortable with? C, my husband tells me that I don't have a say over our finances because I am a stay-at-home mom and don't contribute to the family income? Or D, all of the above? And I will spare you singing the Jeopardy song, but think about it for a second and enter your answer into the chat. If somebody can tell me, because I can't see the chat and I don't know if I'm allowed to open it without messing the screen up. So if somebody could tell me what answers we are seeing.
We're seeing pretty much D's across the board.
There's about 15 or 20 people saying D.
Okay, ding, ding, ding. Yes, all super smart people. Yes, so patriarchy has a lot of different faces and it shows up in all of those ways in addition to many more, right? So these are just some potential examples that we could point to, everything from Trump saying grab him by the pussy to the rolling back of reproductive rights, including access to abortion, to the use by advertisement agencies of the body, commodification of the body, glorification of rape culture. You can see in this Dolce & Gabbana terrifying photo up here at the top, the discrepancy in wages. Down here at the bottom right, there's a picture that kind of speaks to the gender norms that we've been taught since birth, right? That people who identify as women are supposed to like babies and jewelry and nail polish, and people who identify as men are supposed to like video games and money and working on cars, right? So those are all different examples of patriarchy. Wanted to go through just a couple aspects of patriarchy. These are some of the key things that we think define patriarchy. So patriarchy relies on a gender binary and then also operates within it to give men more power than and power over women and gender non-conforming people. It structures all human relationships as familial, through which the head of the family, that's designated as the father, owns the family. So owns the wife, owns the children. It's the framework for the domination and oppression of LGBTQ people. This is a piece of the definition that I feel like is left out a lot and people don't recognize. And lastly, is entwined with the systems of capitalism and white supremacy to shape society as a whole. So as I was saying at the beginning, it's a system. It's not just something that influences our relationships to specific people. It undergirds our entire society. So in the face of patriarchy, there's always been resistance, right? And that resistance has taken many different forms. Women, and particularly women of color, as Anna was saying, have been resisting all over the world. Some people call it feminism, some don't. At GGJ, we feel like it's important to really claim that word and to remake it, to form it from our own politic, to demystify the concept. So one definition that's offered by Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks is a Black feminist activist and scholar. She's written a lot of really important literature and books that have contributed to the feminist movement. So the definition that she offers of feminism is a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation and oppression. It implies that all sexist thinking and action is the problem, whether those who perpetuate it are female or male, child or adult. So this is a super simple, potentially oversimplified definition, right? Because we know that different systems of oppression intersect and overlap in different ways, so that each person's experience of patriarchy is unique. And so, you know, we know that a lot of people are kind of wary of taking on the word or the concept of feminism or identifying with it. And a lot of that is because at different points in history, people have, in the name of feminism, emphasized gender oppression to the point of excluding people that actually should have been in the center. So women of color, particularly Black women, Indigenous women, and folks from the LGBT community. But as I said before, that we feel like it's really important to take that feminism back, to reclaim it and mold it according to our own politic. Sorry, I'm gonna check time because I have to, okay, here we go. So given that, it shouldn't be surprising then that there are many different forms of resistance. The feminism itself has many different articulations. So we have everything from ecofeminism to liberal feminism to trans feminism, Black feminism, radical feminism, Marxist feminism, and cultural feminism. And those are just very few in the bucket, right? But I'm gonna actually pass it to Paige and followed by Simone. Paige, I'm gonna set a timer for 3 minutes. First, Paige is gonna talk a little bit around some of like the main core tenets of Black feminism and the unique perspective that it offers and why it's important. And Simone will do the same for Indigenous feminism.
All right, thanks, Priya. Again, my name is Paige. My pronouns are she, her, and I work at Right to the City Alliance. And I identify as a queer Black feminist leftist. To explain what I mean by Black feminism, I'd like to share this quote by Audre Lorde. I am a Black feminist. I mean, I recognize that my power, as well as my primary oppressions, come as a result of my Blackness, as well as my womanness, and therefore my struggles on both of these fronts are inseparable. Black feminism is important because of its articulation of these inseparable fronts. If we are to dismantle racial capitalist patriarchy to build a new world in its stead, we should listen to and follow the lead of the people who live at the intersections of multiple oppressions. And I believe the Grassroots Feminism's framework attempts to speak to this importance. Because anti-Blackness is the foundation of white supremacism, and because racial capitalism weaponizes white supremacism in pursuit of the bottom line, and because of the intersections that we occupy as Black people, especially Black women and queer and trans people, it means that we must be among the leading forces of a multiracial united front that articulates not only how all of these systems of oppression operate, and why they need to be dismantled, but also what we're going to build in its place. I recently attended a Black feminist summer school in Cachoeira, which is a small town in the interior of Bahia, which is the Brazilian state that has the greatest African influence in that country from the slave trade. Cachoeira is considered to be the birthplace of Candomblé, which is an Afro-Brazilian syncretic religion. And it has been a spiritual center of the Afro-Brazilian religious community for generations. The town is unofficially run by a bunch of Black women elders, the Irmandade da Boa Morte, the Sisterhood of Good Death. They provide not only spiritual but also cultural leadership. And their influence over the town was evident to me, not just in the respectful way that locals treated these elders, but also just how I didn't witness or experience any instances of street harassment the entire time I was there. This is not to say that women and queer and trans people are always safe in Cachoeira, but the fact that street harassment didn't seem to be culturally acceptable there signifies to me that Black feminism is more than simply theoretical. It's a practice that people have been engaged in long before it was named as such, and that its impacts can be liberating. Just to wrap up, Anna mentioned the rise of neo-fascism and authoritarianism. So we know that the stakes are very high, and the opportunity is ripe for us to shift the balance of power away from the neoliberal bloc that's responsible for wreaking so much havoc on Black communities globally. And with Black feminism and a multiracial unity around a vision for our collective liberation based on the wisdom and magic of our ancestors, and with developed Black feminist political leadership, and with sharp assessments and strategy, we can move past just trying to stop the bleeding. We can actually transform society. We can actually get free. Thank you.
Thanks, Paige. Simone, I'll pass it to you.
I'm going to unmute myself. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Simone Senegals. I work at the Indigenous Environmental Network in northern Minnesota. I am mixed race. My mother is Indigenous from the Red Lake Nation, Anishinaabe, and my father is from Argentina of Italian descent. So welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to be able to talk very briefly with you about Indigenous feminism. And that's an interesting word. We play around with that word a lot. We're not sure if that word even really existed in Indigenous languages pre-contact. But what we want to do is we want to really recognize that when we're talking about Indigenous peoples, that we're talking about a very diverse group of nations and people and culture and practices and philosophies, and that we can't lump them all together. But what we can say, and I'm going to slow down for the interpreter, is that we have all experienced colonization and the effects of it. And so whether we had the word for feminism or the need to address that concept before, we do now. So within our collective oppression, there is a need to tease out specifically what's going on with women and femmes. And I remember when I was in high school, and I'm looking at my timer I'm almost halfway through here. But when I was in high school, I was asking one of my aunties about feminism, and she said, we don't say that word, we don't talk like that, because our liberation is not just for our women, but it's for our entire communities. She said, feminism is a white woman word. And I thought a lot about that, right? You know, and I recognize that she's correct, but I also recognize that I am a feminist. And that we are doing feminist work no matter whether we talk about it or not, because within our current context, within our state of being in a colonized state, we have to address the internalized patriarchy and misogyny that has happened to our communities. And I've got 30 seconds left here. So I just want to really stress that for us, we have to define feminism for ourselves. What does that mean for us? When I think about feminism and my own work, I have to think about it in terms of my family and the generations and what my work is within this current political context, within this current time. So my great-grandmother died in childbirth because of racism in the healthcare system. Her life was not valuable at all to the people who are supposed to who are supposed to be helping her bring life into this world, right? My grandmother was in boarding school and she died of heartache. And my mother is of the American Indian generation, and she did her work. And so now I am doing mine. And I think for Indigenous women we're teasing out this word feminism, we are all figuring it out for ourselves within these bigger contexts that we are dealing with, and that we recognize that what happens to the land happens to the body, and that we know that violence against women, the disempowering of Indigenous women, all is tied to, is a tool for stealing land, stealing our homelands, and that as we're gaining as we're liberating ourselves, we have to think about all these complexities. And I'm already over time, so I want to be respectful to everyone else who's speaking, and so I will end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you both so much. Thank you, Paige. Thank you, Simone, both for that powerful insight. And just to wrap this section up, I think, yeah, you know, at GGJ, we talk about a diversity of feminisms, because feminism on its own, as we've seen, has meant very different things to different people and has been oftentimes used to advance interests that are not reflective of our politic. And so we talk about a diversity of feminisms, and then we also try to pull from Black feminism, Indigenous feminism, and all the feminist values that we do appreciate to try and understand what would it mean to articulate and reclaim feminism for the grassroots. So with that, we think about grassroots feminism as distinct and necessary because it is led by women of color, LGBTQ people, poor and working class people. And all of those folks are operating with the understanding that their oppression is rooted in patriarchy and its connections to capitalism, colonization, white supremacy, transphobia, and homophobia. But ultimately understanding that the liberation of women is bound to the liberation of all oppressed peoples. To go through just a few of the core tenets that we understand as being critical to grassroots feminism. First is emphasizing that patriarchy is a system, that it needs to be dismantled because just locking up perpetrators doesn't address root causes. Insisting on intersections and overlaps between systems of oppression, because racism, capitalism, and patriarchy all rely on and need one another in order to survive. It supports the grassroots leadership of women of color and LGBTQ people. It pushes for an economy that prioritizes people and planet. It pushes beyond representation because it is not enough to elect a woman to office or to push her up a corporate ladder. It celebrates and honors transgender and gender non-conforming people and rejects the construct of a gender binary. And it builds solidarity with global resistance. So I know that's just a lot of things and we don't have a whole lot of time to talk through them, but like I said before, I want to make sure that folks know that we're going to try and open up other avenues so people can really get into the nitty-gritty of this and like really tease it apart to try to understand more deeply what it means. But just wanted to provide you all with an overview of what we're thinking and how we're articulating grassroots feminism as an evolving concept and something that we want to keep kind of sharpening with the insight from our membership and base. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Anna to talk about how this relates to the economy and what it means to dismantle a capitalist economy and advance a feminist one.
Thank you, Priya. Thanks for giving that context of grassroots feminism. I hope that that helps folks start to reclaim the term feminism for our base, for the grassroots. And in order to build grassroots feminism, we must challenge racialized and gendered capitalism. And this is a key component to our movements that we've understood for decades, but we haven't always had the strongest feminist approach to advancing our movements to challenge racialized and gendered capitalism. So, Priya, if you could go to the next slide. When we think about our current economic system under capitalism, when we think about the economy, we often think about jobs and we think about labor. And when we think about jobs and labor, we think about getting paid. We think about salaries. Whether we're thinking about jobs in the manufacturing or production sector, or whether it's jobs where we're putting to use our intellectual and artistic labor, these are all jobs that we are assuming get paid, receive salaries on various scales. But when we look at this graphic of an iceberg, if we use an iceberg as an analogy for our current economic system, we see that understanding the economy as paid labor is really only the tip of that iceberg. If we look at the bigger picture, at the full economy, what's below the surface, beyond the tip of the iceberg, we see other forms of labor. We see an informal sector of labor. We see, when we think about the historical context of our current economy, and we think about several decades ago, several hundred years ago, centuries ago, we think about how our economic system was set up, and how wealthy folks in the ruling class, were reliant on subsistent peasant labor. And that's actually still true to this day when we think about how agricultural labor, for example, migrant labor, if we're thinking about in the US context, is exploited and for the benefit of folks in a more privileged position. And we also see, when we're looking at the bigger picture, the rest of the iceberg, housework, care work, and we see nature. And the rest of my portion of this presentation, I want to talk about what care work is. When we think about care work, we think about the work that is put into raising a family, taking care of our family. And when I say taking care of family, I don't exclusively mean taking care of children. I also mean taking care of extended family, our elders, our aunties and uncles, our grandparents, and our chosen family as well. And oftentimes that care work is associated with women. That's not necessarily the natural division of labor. However, it is a division of labor that is imposed upon us by patriarchy and capitalism. It's a gendered division of labor. And another way of thinking about that care work, or another terminology we can use to talk about that care work, is reproductive labor. And so this image kind of makes the comparison between that care work or reproductive labor and the production labor. So we're looking at an image of a factory. We see an industrial background, and we see the line factory. And instead of seeing items being produced or manufactured along that line, we're seeing women doing the care work, caring for someone, doing the household work, the ironing, the cooking, the cleaning. And then it goes back to the production line. And one thing that's really important to understand when we think about reproductive labor or care labor is that this is the specific kind of labor that is essential for human survival. So if we think about it in that terms, in comparison to the paid labor of producing something, producing items, that is not essential to human survival. And so it makes us question, or I hope that it would make folks question, why do we value the production labor in a monetary way? Why do we offer it money, but we don't value the care labor that is critical for human survival and for us to flourish as a society? So with that question in mind, I'll read our working definition of reproductive labor. It is the labor necessary for social reproduction, such as purchasing household goods, preparing food, washing clothes, caring for children and elders, and maintaining community ties. It involves mental, emotional, and manual physical labor that takes place inside or outside of the home and can be paid or unpaid. And so when we think about this contradiction of what labor we value by offering it payment and what labor goes unpaid or underpaid, and we also think about the division of labor and who's doing the paid labor or the labor that's valued by our economic system and who's doing the labor that is not valued or undervalued, we see that oftentimes it is women doing the care work, it is women doing the reproductive labor, and that labor is often unpaid or underpaid. And this quote from the United Nations, that is now a fairly old quote from 1995, really underscores the unjust division of labor and underscores how unjust it is that we do not value reproductive labor or labor associated with women. And I'll read the quote. If women's unpaid work were properly valued, it would come to a staggering $16 trillion, increasing the officially estimated global output by about 70%. Again, that's $16 trillion, and that is understanding money in 1995 terms. So that would increase if we think about it in 2019 terms. So how do we work towards not only representation, but redistribution? And when I'm saying representation, I'm going back to thinking about feminism versus grassroots feminism. When we think about the current mainstream dialogue around feminism and how it's showing up in our political dialogue and how it's even showing up in this current election season, presidential election season, we're hearing a lot about representation of women. We want to visibilize women. We want to see women in positions of leadership, whether it's in elected leadership or in leadership within the labor sector. We want to see more women CEOs. We want to see more women directors, women bosses. And that is a language that we're often hearing in mainstream discourse about what feminism is. And that is a rather superficial understanding of feminism, of speaking in terms of breaking a glass ceiling and moving up into positions of power, because basically that understanding of feminism is allowing for current systems of oppression to continue to exist. All it is asking for is that the gender of the folks in positions of power, in positions to continue to be the oppressors, to change. And for those of us in social justice movement sectors and those of us who embrace grassroots feminism or any of the feminisms within grassroots feminism, we understand that we're not trying to be the new oppressors. And it doesn't matter whether our oppressors are identified as male or female. Oppression is oppression. And so representation does not challenge patriarchy. Representation does not challenge white supremacy, and it does not challenge capitalism. So we are demanding more than representation. Our demands go beyond representation. We are demanding a redistribution and a rethinking of economy. Economy is a social science. It is not a natural science. there are not fixed rules. It is a social science that was designed by people, and people created the set of rules. And that means that we, as people, can challenge those rules and create our own rules. And when we look at our communities historically, we see that there are different ways societies have set up their management systems, their ways of interacting with one another. In other words, they had various kinds of economies. And so our current economic system, capitalism, is not a fixed or necessary system, and it's not natural. And we know that not only is it not natural, it is actually physically doing harm and damage to us. The most obvious example of that is how it is damaging our environment, our climate, and how it is damaging Mother Earth. And so a feminist economy is a way of thinking about an alternative. It is an offering of a new kind of economy. There are several different kinds of alternative economies and different ways of talking about economy. Those of you who are listening, who are working in the environmental and climate justice world, you'll be familiar with the terminology around regenerative economy. Feminist economy is like a regenerative economy, and it's not in competition with other alternative economies. It's just an offering around what an alternative can be. It is an offering of an economy that centers life over production. And there are, what we're breaking down around feminist economy, 3 pillars that help us understand what a feminist economy is. One would be, it ensures bodily autonomy. Another way of thinking of that is it ensures that we as individuals have self-determination over our bodies, in contrast to capitalism that commodifies our bodies against our will. Another pillar of feminist economy is that it exists in just relationship with nature. It is not an extractive economy that exploits the natural world or natural resources. And finally, the third pillar of a feminist economy is that it socializes reproduction. All of that reproductive labor that I just referenced before. A feminist economy offers a system that socializes that reproduction so that all members of economy take on that labor, and that reproductive labor is not divided along gender binary lines, but instead understood as a necessary component for a healthy, thriving community, and everyone has a role to play in that reproductive labor. So when we break down these pillars, and we'll start with the first one, ensuring bodily autonomy, that challenges capitalism's necessity for turning us as individuals into commodities. And so under a capitalist system, we're seen as cogs in the machine, so to speak. We're just seen as our labor and what we can contribute to the current economic system. And it has no regards for our personal well-being, our personal health, and the way in which it treats the workers is as disposable. And it relies on even the reproduction of us as humans to replace those of us who can no longer do the work. And so it needs people to constantly reproduce, to provide workers to contribute to the production, and the production of goods that profit a small few. We know that those who are on the production level do not make as much money as those who own the companies that distribute what is being produced. And so we have control over our own bodies. We are no longer seen as cogs in the machine. We are seen as humans, as a part of our ecosystem in relationship to Mother Nature. And that leads into the second pillar of feminist economy. We live in just relationship with nature. We are not seeing Mother Earth as a source of extracting resources for our own personal use or gain. we also understand that we don't necessarily need to rely on, say, for example, fossil fuels for a functioning society. When we think about switching to a different source of our energy, there are many other sources that are not damaging to Mother Earth. For example, switching from fossil fuel-based energy to solar or wind energy, and also understanding that in that transition, that means that folks are going to have to transition out of the current economic system. Some of us are reliant on the dirty energy jobs, whether we want to be or not. It's not necessarily a choice, but in that transition to an economy where we're in just relationship with nature, we need to emphasize that all of us are able to transition into this new economy and are able to thrive in that new economy. And then think about jobs, the kind of jobs that would be in relationship and harmony with Mother Nature. And then finally, when we think about socializing reproduction or socializing reproductive labor, an example of that would be a childcare collective, like we see in this graphic on the screen. And so if folks who have children are needing to contribute to the economy in various ways, we also have to ensure that the care for family and for children doesn't fall on one individual and doesn't fall on just the women in the community. It's a collective effort. Another way of thinking about socializing reproduction or socializing care work is socializing healthcare, ensuring that everyone has their basic human rights met. And so that would mean everyone has access to healthcare, everyone has access to childcare, everyone has access to education beyond adolescent education. People have access to higher education. And it would also mean that care work beyond the immediate family, care work for the community, is socialized and shared and valued. And I'm hearing the alarm. I want to just add to the 3 pillars of a feminist economy: ensuring bodily autonomy, in just relationship with Mother Nature, and socializing reproduction. Beyond that, a feminist economy centers life over production, is non-hierarchical, it is not exploitative. And another important part of a feminist economy is understanding that we're not necessarily starting from scratch and building something brand new. We have examples of economies that have functioned in a way that is synchronized with how we're describing feminist economy. And so when we are in the process of reclaiming our ancestral knowledge, there are examples in our history of how communities and economies have functioned in a non-extractive way, non-exploitative way, in a way that does not divide labor necessarily along gender lines, and does not pit genders against one another or lift up one gender in a position of power over another. And I will pause there for time.
Awesome. Thank you, Anna. Great. So that was a lot of content. And from there, we're actually going to shift into hearing from some of our members and allies about, beyond the content, why it's important to actually move into action and apply a gender justice feminist lens to the work that folks are moving on the ground across various fronts of struggle. So I'm going to invite our panelists to turn on their videos if they're not already on, so folks can see your faces. And then Anna, I don't know if you want to say a little bit more before they go into their section.
Sure. I'll share that our panelists are from member organizations of GGJ, and they have all been actively involved in GGJ's Grassroots Feminism and Gender Justice work group for different lengths of time. And they will all speak to a little bit about their work, but also how a grassroots feminist lens strengthens their local community work. And so we've got a speaker from Mujeres Unidas y Activas, Silvia Lopez, and we also have a speaker from East Michigan Environmental Action Council, that's Piper Carter. And hopefully, while the first panelist speaks, I'm going to try and reconnect with our sister from the World March of Women in Mozambique. She was able to connect earlier, but she's having some internet problems. I'm hoping to be able to at least connect with her by phone so that she could talk about the World March of Women, who Katia already mentioned. It's an international movement of which we are a part of, and we have started a movement within the US. So with that said, I'll introduce the first of the three panelists. We'll start with Silvia Lopez from Mujeres Unidas y Activas. And for those folks who were not able to join at the beginning, I'll let you know that we are providing this presentation bilingually. Silvia will be presenting in Spanish, and folks who are listening in on Zoom will hear the interpreter interpreting in English. And so there might be a pause as we transition to Silvia and the interpretation in English.
¿Me escuchan?
Nico or Florencia, if one of you is speaking, we can't hear you, just so you know.
We're waiting for Sylvia to fix her phone, and then we'll be on shortly.
Great. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Silvia Lopez from Mujeres Unidas y Activas. My pronoun is she, her. Mujeres is an organization formed by Latina women, and we have a double mission of personal empowerment and community power to achieve social and economic justice. We're in San Francisco, Oakland, and Union City. As immigrant women, we recognize that humans migrate to seek a better future for our families. And in some cases, we are women who have left their children to be able to send resources, to be able to have food, clothes, better opportunities of education and housing, and to flee the strife of violence and war that we were facing. Today, we see women and families that are migrating with their children and fleeing their countries due to lack of opportunities, because the fields have been contaminated with toxic products by corporations that are responsible for polluting our air, our water, our earth. Most of those companies are from the US, from Europe. Some companies are local, but are manipulated by the capitalist system, and they steal our natural resources to make profits, and they poison field workers and their families and steal from them their only form of labor. And because people have been trying to defend have been trying to defend their... Hold on one sec, I'm going to ask her to speak more slowly. Silvia, ¿podría hablar un poquitito más lento? ¿Podría repetir esa última parte y hablar un poquitito más lento, por favor? Gracias. So they have formed caravans and they've been walking for days, exposing themselves to great challenges, crossing borders, just to try to find an opportunity. And they come across this system, the same system that made them have to leave their own countries. And this time they're facing a very real wall that has been erected with hatred and discrimination, and they're being denied asylum by a dehumanized system. And the migration is an emergency, is a survival issue. And at Mujeres Unidas y Activas, we have received comrades that have arrived in the caravans, that have been threatened and they have left their children. We have comrades that have been very directly impacted because their family members have been traveling, women who have been tortured. And at Mujeres Unidas, we also recognize that as immigrants, we have crossed borders. And our great struggle and resistance doesn't end when we cross. We still face it. As women workers, as immigrants, we feel that fear of going out to work every day, maybe because we might not see our children again, because we have been raped, we have been beaten, murdered, or deported. As women and workers, most of us do domestic work, cleaning homes, taking care of children, and taking care of people with disabilities. It's important to recognize the history of injustice of domestic workers. Historically, they've been women of color doing domestic work. And that's where we've seen the roots of slavery. It's been unpaid work, exploited work, unfair work, unjust work, work where there's sexual harassment, abuse, shameful work. To this woman's work was given a lower status than men's work. It's unrecognized and unvalued work. Work that was excluded of labor laws because it's a job that a woman has to do it. It's her obligation. And the woman is considered inferior to men. That's why she was assigned unvalued work. It's part of patriarchy, where men have more power and they are exposed to better jobs, better salaries. They have more recognition and power. It's a system that's led by men. Recently, we have had some victory with women in higher positions, and it's been a struggle of many years. But it's also important to know why we have laws today that protect women who do domestic work. It has been a struggle of more than 10 years, which started with recognizing ourselves, recognizing our value, ourselves, and fighting those internalized stereotypes, educating ourselves, informing ourselves and our families, educating our representatives, educating and informing our employers. Nobody gifted us anything. we had to be our own advocates in our own jobs, in the system that excluded us for more than 80 years. And we're still in the struggle because we have to get protections in our jobs, in our lives. We need to be free, to walk free on the streets, free of fear. We need equity in our communities, no matter our race, our color, our religion, our sexual preference. We need humanity and respect for all human beings. We need rights for all workers, for all domestic workers. It's a feminist fight. And because it represents women, we know it's a huge fight with a lot of resistance, that requires a lot of resistance to patriarchy. And that's the key that determines the oppression on all of our community. We have to overcome the oppression that generations of us have fought against. Every day we go out in the movement resisting this and to fight for our rights as women and as immigrants and as workers.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Silvia. And thank you, Florencia, for the interpretation. And so as we move on from the intersections of grassroots feminism or gender justice and immigrant rights and the rights of workers and domestic workers, we will transition into thinking about intersections of grassroots feminism and climate and environmental justice. So I will pass the mic to Piper Carter from East Michigan Environmental Action Council, and the acronym is EMEAC. Piper, take it away.
So, can you hear me? Hello? Can
Yes.
everybody hear me? Yes, okay.
Yes.
Actually,
Hi
Piper, you might want
everyone.
to turn off your
My
video.
name's Piper. I am in Detroit, Michigan. I turn off what?
You may want to turn off your video because actually the sound is a little distorted. Maybe turning off your video will help. Yes. Okay, try that.
Okay, how about now?
That sounds better.
Okay, so my name is Piper Carter. I live in Detroit, Michigan, and my organization again is East Michigan Environmental Action Council. I wanted to speak very briefly, just a couple of minutes about our connection that we have in Detroit to water. I'll say very briefly about the water issues that we have in Detroit. So the main issue is the water shutoffs. And basically what has happened is because we had a so-called bankruptcy in 2008, we got what was called a financial manager, which created financial martial law. And so with that, we had one of our municipalities one of our municipal services taken over, which was the water. And so with that, it was decided to shut off over 100,000 homes from access to their water. And so with that, there's been an escalation in hepatitis. Actually, there's a hepatitis epidemic that the health department is suppressing the numbers because of gentrification. People don't have access to bathing. You know, they don't have access to using their to relieve themselves in a bathroom. They don't have access to clean themselves, to clean their children. You know, when you have your menstruation, you know, there may be a smell that occurs. So a lot of girls are maybe missing school. And long story short, it's a very disturbing epidemic because it's disturbing the order of the home. And on many fronts, one of the major disruptions that's happening, or violence that I should say is happening, is that it's being peoples whose water is being shut off are also being criminalized. And so the women and parents who are found to have no water are having their children taken away from them, from Child Protective Services. When the water department comes out to a home to shut off water, they send the Detroit Police Department, as well as Child Protective Services, as well as hazmat. They have the home declared unfit for living, and they have the parent declared unfit for parenting, and they charge them with child abuse, neglect, and other charges. And then when they take the children from them, then they put those children in the juvenile detention center. And so there's multiple layers of all of this that within the 7 minutes is very difficult to go into, but those are the main, you know, points that I wanted to just hit. But just thinking of not being able to have access to, you know, clean water in general, and also a major impact that happens environmentally. So let's say if you live on a street where they're aggressively cutting off water, there may be multiple homes on that same street whose water has been cut off, which means that system's not being used. And so that water is just sitting there, and, you know, waterborne diseases occur. And the people who do live in their homes are also susceptible to those waterborne diseases because they're on the same water line. And so it's literally a public health issue on many levels. It's a criminalization of poor people, and disproportionately we're speaking of mostly Black and Latinx, you know, folks who would be considered below the poverty line. And so it's an attack on people because they're poor, and because they're Black, and because they're brown. And most of these people are women identified, you know, women identified bodies. Most of these people are will be considered heads of household. So it's breaking up families, it's destroying family structure, it's destroying stability, it's destroying people's, you know, basic right to live. You know, water is a human right. And the basis of this whole fight is that there are people who are fighting against the ideology that water is a human right, that water should be free. They believe water should be commodified and sold. And so this is our fight. We do have a water ability plan that's been on the table that we've been fighting to get at both the city as well as currently fighting against, in addition to all of our other fights. So I would put it like a period there because that's probably like 7 minutes already.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Piper. And unfortunately, it seems like we are unable to connect to Grasa. Grasa from Mozambique. Grasa is representing the International Secretariat of the World March of Women. Again, Katia mentioned a little bit about who the World March of Women are, what their movement is, and it's unfortunate that Grasa can't join us, but I can share a bit more and elaborate on the introduction that Katia gave us at the top of this presentation. So it is an international feminist movement. It is not an organization that organizes a march once a year. It is much more than that. It is a movement that was started in 2000, or around the end of 99, early 2000. So it's been in motion for 20 years. And there are 65 chapters across the globe, many of which are in the global south, but they're not exclusively in the global south. For example, the newest chapter, the US chapter, is housed within Grassroots Global Justice. And it is a growing process. It enables us to connect to grassroots feminist movement across the globe, and it also connects us to this resistance that I mentioned at the top of the presentation. We're seeing a necessary resistance to the rise of neo-fascism and the rise of authoritarianism, and we're seeing also the fact that there is a pattern of women leading this resistance, folks who are gender oppressed leading this resistance, folks who challenge the gender binary are leading this resistance. And just that language alone is so crucial to our resistance movements, understanding that the gender binary actually upholds and supports capitalism. When we think about what I mentioned in describing economies and the way capitalism functions, capitalism needs the gender binary to define labor, because if we're understanding that the reproductive labor is necessary for human survival, it's necessary for the survival of those folks who are doing the production labor, then capitalism defines that folks who are women identified, do the reproductive labor at home, the unpaid labor, to support the men doing the production labor. And so when we think about gender binary in those terms, it helps us to understand that it's more than just personal identification, more than an identity issue. Challenging the gender binary is actually a tool, and it strengthens our strategy to challenge racialized and gendered capitalism. And so that brings me to this political moment and what we can do here in the US as part of the networks within the It Takes Roots Alliance of Alliances, as part of GGJ, as part of our local organizations. We have a mandate from our international feminist allies, from our international sisters within the World March of Women and beyond, from our comrades who are leading the resistance to the rise of authoritarianism in their home countries. We've been tasked with fighting the rise of authoritarianism, fighting the rise of neo-fascism here at home. And we are accepting the challenge, not only because it's necessary for our communities, for the survival and thriving of our communities, but we recognize that being in the United States means being in the belly of the beast. Part of what has contributed to the rise of the right internationally is US imperialism, is the fact that capitalism needs to spread and colonize and capture and extract in order to continue benefiting a small few. And so in this moment, GGJ, along with our sister alliances, are encouraging our members to think about how we can challenge not just this current iteration of the rise of authoritarianism, which is Trump, but how do we challenge what he stands for? How do we challenge Trumpism? And how do we take advantage of a growing momentum, a rise of resistance to Trump, to expand that movement to we're resisting Trump and we're also resisting everything that he represents. And what he represents is misogyny, is patriarchy, is white supremacy, is capitalism. And if we can incorporate a gender justice lens, if we can embrace grassroots feminism in our movements, we ensure that we are challenging patriarchy in the same way that we are challenging white supremacy. If we understand that those systems of oppression are interlinked and reliant on one another, then our approach and our strategy to challenging them also have to be intersectional, have to challenge all of the systems of oppression. If we think about them as a four-headed monster, white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, and imperialism, we can't kill it by just cutting off one of its head. We've got to cut them all off. We've got to get at the roots of systems of oppression. And when we think historically about social justice movements and their successes and some of their failures, something that we can learn from is how, unfortunately, patriarchy has shown up in our social justice movements and has contributed to the dismantling of our social justice movement. So a way of learning from those experiences and ensuring that that doesn't happen again is understanding that all genders benefit from bringing a grassroots feminist perspective or strategy to resistance movements is beneficial. And when we think about the current presidential election and who's organizing folks to ensure that Trump does not get reelected, we're seeing a lot of talk about women and gender and feminism. When we think about the women's resistance to Trump's being elected the first time around, we think of the Women's March, and they have made a big splash in the political arena in talking about gender issues, in talking about women, and talking about women not just in representation forms, also talking about the need for redistribution. And we're also seeing an emergence of new alliances emerging because of the response to the moment of presidential elections happening. For example, the supermajority is a new alliance organizing women voters who are registered as Democrats or who are likely to vote for a Democratic candidate, to be a force to ensure that Trump is defeated. And knowing that we've long been connected to political movements and our goal has always been to challenge authoritarianism as we see it, we have an opportunity to make an intervention in these efforts to ensure that Trump is defeated. And we understand that that work is more than just electing one of the many presidential candidates. It's more than electing one of the women involved in that group of presidential candidates, but it's ensuring that whoever will be the person to defeat Trump also prioritizes what is politically important to our movements, to our communities. And so we're thinking about various ways of making this intervention. And one of them is creating a political platform that can be used, that outlines our political priorities, and framing that political platform as a grassroots feminist political platform, and ensuring that every priority in that platform, whether it's an economic justice priority or a climate justice priority or a housing justice priority, that those are articulated from a grassroots feminist perspective, and every priority is intersectional, understanding that we don't live single issue lives. And if we can get that political platform to be distributed on a national level beyond our membership, beyond GGJ, beyond It Takes Roots, and actually see it go viral, we might actually have an opportunity to influence the debates happening around the the presidential elections. We've already seen our movements influencing the current vying for within the Democratic Party, the current vying to be the nominee to run against Trump. We've heard some of the nominees in the debates already say things like just transitions. We've heard some of the candidates talk about trans folks and trans women when we think about health access and thinking about health access to all folks, making it accessible to all genders. And this is not something we would have heard in the Democratic primaries in 2016 or before. And so this is showing that our movements are making some headway and we can go further. We have an opportunity to go further. And not only do we have an opportunity to go further, we have a duty to go further, because while we've been seeing a slow rise of authoritarianism for many years now, it has gone from a slow rise to an accelerated speed. And if we don't speed up our movements and get beyond debating about what feminism means and moving into a space where we understand that grassroots feminism is a key strategy to resisting the right, then we might meet them at their own speed and might be able to resist, slow, curb the rise of authoritarianism at home in the belly of the beast. I'll pause there because I think we also want to give participants an opportunity to ask some questions.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. And it's a shame that Graça couldn't join us, but if folks have more interest in the World March of Women, I encourage people to look online. There's plenty of information, but also reach out to us at GGJ because there's lots that we could share about the US chapter of the World March of Women, and also just the general understanding that grassroots internationalism is core to the work that we're doing, and that grassroots internationalism and gender justice have a key relationship as well. So I do want to take a couple minutes. We don't have too much time, but could maybe just take a few questions. So I want to invite Cynthia, who's on the call, to share out some of the questions that may have come up through the chat. So Cynthia, while you're compiling those, also just want to actually just pause for 1 minute for folks on the Spanish line. If there are any questions that you want to ask anybody who's spoken on the call, you can put it to everyone. If you want to text a question to Paige, you can do that, or you can say it now on the Spanish line and ask the interpreter to place it in the chat. So it will take just a minute to do that. And then Cynthia, I'm going to ask you to speak the questions you have in mind. All right, this is such a tease because I've been seeing the little flasher telling me that there's all this amazing conversation happening, but I can't.
The conversation is saying that there's no questions coming up in the chat so far and on the Spanish line.
Okay, great. Well, maybe we've answered everything.
Can I just say we've gotten a few questions about how many participants. We have seen participant numbers fluctuate between 50 and 60.
We have a question.
Hooray!
Hooray. So we have a question from Cynthia Redmond. How can we challenge what Trump stands for?
So many ways.
Great question. Yes.
So many ways. Anna, I think it might make sense to talk about the Defeat Trumpism like the convergence that's happening leading into the proposal. We talked about that. You talked about it a little bit at the top of the call, but Cynthia, I don't know where you're writing in from, but it might be something you might be interested in getting involved in.
I can start, and Cynthia, if you want to add anything, feel free. So I mentioned this tool of a political platform and using it as a way of ensuring that the candidates who are running against Trump are centering our political priorities, which are centered in grassroots feminism. And beyond a political platform, we're looking at a year ahead of us of a lot of work and probably a lot of rapid responses to crises moments. We've already had several crises moments in the current Trump administration, from responding to the militarized border and responding to the separation of families and putting migrants in detention centers, to responding to mass shootings that are rooted in white supremacy. And we're going to see more of that. We're going to see more of it in this presidential election cycle. And knock on wood, hope it doesn't happen. But if Trump is elected again for another 4 years, we're going to see an increase. So we're going to have to strengthen our rapid response muscle and get creative around our direct actions and ensure that our political priorities, and in this case, our grassroots feminist political priorities, are centered in our direct actions. And so we've already been thinking not only in rapid response mode, but how do we plan something that gives us time to make whatever we're planning have a national effect, have a national impact. So one thing that I did not mention when talking about the World March of Women is that every 5 years, they invite all members across the globe into a year of feminist action. And coincidentally, that year of feminist action is 2020. And so we are accepting the invitation to join a year of feminist action, and that will kick off on International Women's Day, March 8th, 2020. And it will end in October of 2020 on International Day to Eradicate Poverty. So within that time frame, we are already thinking about what are our grassroots feminist interventions, what are our direct actions. We might be able to have a grassroots feminist action at the border because the separation of families is a grassroots feminist issue. The resistance to treating migration as a crime is a grassroots feminist resistance. And how do we make that obvious in our response, in our actions? And so you will be invited in our actions being planned for next year. And not only the actions that we're planning out, but there will have to be some rapid response as well. And we want to think about our rapid response actions from a grassroots feminist perspective. I'll pass it over to any of the other panelists if you want to add anything.
Before any other folks chime in, Cynthia, I just want to check, are there any other questions that I just want to, just for time, see?
Yes, we do have other questions.
Okay.
So maybe do the other panelists want to respond? Should we move on?
I would say maybe throw out 2 more questions if there are 2, and we'll get responses from whoever wants to answer, and then we'll move on.
Perfect. So we do have 2 questions on deck. So the first one is, does GGJ or World March of Women have a role in the National Women's March in January? So that's number 1. And then a second one is, how do reproductive justice organizations, feminist women's studies scholars, and young women fit into this movement? How do we bring them in?
I can respond to the first question, and I'll share the opportunity to respond to the second question with the co-panelists. DGJ or World March of Women, or both, do we have a role to play in the annual Women's March in January? So as you all know, the Women's March was not just a one-time response to Trump's election in 2017, but there have been anniversary marches ever since. And I'm not involved in the planning for the next march, or if there will be a march in January, but I do know that the Women's March priority right now is promoting their own political platform. It's the Women's Agenda, And I believe you can see the Women's Agenda, or at least get access to it through the Women's March website. When you go to the Women's March website, one of the first things you will see is the Women's Agenda, and it outlines their political priorities. And a lot of their political priorities do line up with the political priorities of Grassroots Global Justice and It Takes Roots and our member organizations. And I know that they've been hoping to use that political platform as a way of pushing different policy initiatives. I think one of the things that they wanted to center was healthcare for all, or Medicare for all, which is one part of their longer platform. But we have gone to women's marches every time that they have happened, whether it's in DC or had members go to their sister marches in different parts of the country. And we have shown up as the GGJ World March of Women contingent, as a grassroots feminist contingent. And if it's politically wise, we will do it again, as we have lots of practice by now in throwing down with them.
Should I repeat the second question?
Sure.
Yeah, so the second question was, how do reproductive justice organizations, feminist women's studies scholars, and young women fit into this movement? How do we bring them in?
I can chime in on that just to say there's absolutely a role. I think a lot of what y'all saw reflected in this webinar was just some initial thinking from GGJ and some of our allies. There's a lot of work that's already been done specifically around political education for grassroots feminism all over the world, and we're actually in an international process right now trying to draw all of that together. But I say that to say there's still a lot to learn and a lot of thinking still to do. And so, you know, we really want to take leadership from our grassroots base and also ground our practice in like deep study and learning. So there's always a role for feminist scholars and activists to kind of help us enrich our understanding both of like the history of social movements and what are the ways in which we can, what are the lessons that we can learn, but also like what are the theories and how can we apply them to the work that is meaningful to us. Does anybody else want to add anything before I kick it to Benishi to close us out? Especially Sylvia or Piper? Okay, all right, it seems like no. So I'm gonna pass it to Benishi, but before I do, I just wanted to say, you know, to the question before about like, how do we defeat Trumpism? What's the role that feminism can play? I think I just wanna emphasize, you know, there's been a lot of talk about feminism in the past couple of years. I think it was last year that feminism was like the most Googled word. But I think it's on us, it's our responsibility to recognize it not just as a sexy term or a exciting concept, but something that we can really like tease apart and figure out how do we deploy it in a strategic way to advance the cause that we all believe in and to advance the struggles that we're all in the midst of. And to really understand what is the potential for grassroots feminism to serve as an antidote, as a counterweight to fascism and neoliberalism. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Benishi to close us out.
Thank you, everyone. I thank you, everyone on the call, for being patient with the time. Lots of important information being shared. And I want to thank all the panelists and Grassroots Global Justice for taking the time to be like very thorough with this. And so just a couple of reminders is at the beginning of the call, we talked about It Takes Roots and this collective work that we're doing together, and about the road to the convening. And so there's lots of things coming up there. You know, there's the encuentros that are going to be coming up. There's a toolkit that if people want to like access and use the toolkit to engage some of this in your own communities, that's is available for folks in our networks and our memberships. And then we have a few more of these webinars coming up. The next one at the end of September is with the Indigenous Environmental Network, and we'll be highlighting sovereignty, and also the rights of nature and rights of Mother Earth. And what does that mean to our sort of collective organizing work? In October, there will be one on housing rights and affordable housing. And then the final one, sorry, I'm like just remembering that I need to talk slow for the translation. And then the final one in November, it will be on grassroots internationalism. So please come back, let other folks know, and continue to learn about what's happening. There's a question about where they can get the toolkit. So if someone can add a link or information about where people can access the toolkit before we get off the call. And so those are the next things that are coming up. And so again, I want to thank everyone for your patience and going a little extra on this call, and to thank all of the panelists for being here. And then if you want more information about Grassroots Feminism, go to the Grassroots Global Justice website. There's some links and resources there, and find out more about the Feminist Organizing School and other initiatives that are happening with Grassroots Feminism. And so thank you all.
Thanks, Benishi. Yeah, I can't see the chat, so I don't know if somebody else has put it in there, but folks who are looking for the It Takes Roots toolkits, they are on the It Takes Roots website, and they'll continue to get populated as more resources get developed with all of these webinars. And just wanted to re-emphasize the call to be in touch with your organizers to get on the road to the convening. Thanks, everybody. Have a good one. Thanks for being on.